Greetings, Disney adults, Disney fans of all ages, and welcome. Not too long ago, I got a notification on Twitter from one of those Disney news websites or news Twitter feeds. I think you guys know the ones I'm talking about. Sometimes they kind of say things that you're like, really? And this particular headline made me sit up and take notice because basically it said Disney may close Animal Kingdom in 2024. You're sitting there probably doing the same thing I was when I saw the headline. You're going, what? And so I, of course, I opened the headline. I said, I've got to read what this article says. And they were talking to somebody. They said this man has got inside information from Disney, and he said something along the lines of, well, the Disney company found out that it's more expensive to run this animal park than they originally thought it would be. And so there's discussions that they may have to close the park down. But then by the end of the article, it comes around and says, but we haven't heard any confirmation from any of the big official Disney people. And it starts coming back with, and here's some other things. Why can't they close Disney's Animal Kingdom? And basically, it was all this big headline to try to make me read the article. Success, you did it. I read the article. And I was sitting there going, at D23 last year, didn't they reveal a bunch of new things they were planning to do at Disney's Animal Kingdom? Why would they have done that if they're sitting there thinking, we're going to close Animal Kingdom? But I digress. It did lead me to the question, what would Walt think about the Animal Kingdom? Now, we're going in a little bit different direction. So far, the things I've talked about on this channel have been things such as attractions and tickets and technology. I've spoken about those sorts of things and shared with you what I thought Walt would think based on what he had done versus what is being done now. And that's the point. One of the big points of this channel is to discuss, okay, what would Walt think of what they're doing in the parks now? Walt never even imagined, it was never on Walt Disney's radar that there might ever be what is in essence a zoo on Disney property. I mean, perhaps there's somewhere back in the 60s where he said, maybe someday we could open a zoo. I don't know. But we've got no written evidence. We've got no word that he ever thought about potentially opening a zoo or an animal park or anything like what Animal Kingdom is. So it does seem to serve a question. When Walt Disney and all the Imagineers were talking about the Florida project, and this was back in the mid-60s, Walt Disney had finally, and the Disney Company had finally settled on Central Florida as the location for their East Coast park. Now, at the time, the Florida project had two main things that were going to be part of it. One, of course, was East Coast Disneyland, what would eventually come to be called the Magic Kingdom at Walt Disney World. That was always in the works. Everybody knew that was going to be there. The other thing that was going to be there, of course, was Epcot Center. And this was one of Walt's big dreams, and it was actually called Epcot. And Walt's vision was that it would be a living, breathing, actual city that people lived in. Now, Epcot is very different now from what Walt had envisioned. And that's going to be the subject of maybe a couple of videos somewhere down the road, is what would Walt think of Epcot now. But here's my point for this video. Animal Kingdom, never discussed. Animal Kingdom, never on the radar. So, the question I'm asking today is, what would Walt think of Disney's Animal Kingdom? And I want to kind of get into that. I want to dive into that story just a little bit. We're just going to briefly talk about what Walt would think, and I'll share some of my thoughts and opinions with you. Now, of course, as always, we've got to go back in time to figure out, to kind of get some perspective and to do a little bit of background. So, let's go. Let's go back in time. The True Life Adventure series, created by the Walt Disney Company in the 40s. Now, the 40s were a rough time really all over the world. 1940 until about 1945, the world was embroiled in World War II, and many Americans were overseas in Europe and Asia, fighting in places such as France and Germany, Japan. Now, the Disney Company, with the onset of World War II and on the American side, and with the bombing of Pearl Harbor, well, the Disney studios were kind of enlisted into service by the military as a way to kind of keep an eye on the West Coast just in case any attacks came from over there. Meanwhile, the Disney studios were asked to produce propaganda films and other films to support our troops. Walt Disney was thrilled to do this. He was more than happy to do this. He was a patriotic American. But unfortunately, the Disney studios also lost a lot of money during this time. And after World War II, well, the Disney studios had to figure out a way to kind of infuse themselves with cash, with some money. Now, the Disney studios kind of relied on compilation films such as Ichabod and Mr. Toad, which were basically taking shorter movies, putting them together to create one longer movie. And these worked, but they were not really what Disney needed. So in 1947, Walt Disney contracted with Alfred and Elma Malotte. Alfred and Elma Malotte were married naturalists, and their interest was in shooting film in Alaska. They wanted to shoot the culture and the wildlife up in the area of Alaska, which at the time was not a state, but was instead an American territory. It took them over a year to do this, and when they returned, they had over 100,000 feet of film footage. The Malotes had shot a lot of footage of seals at the Pribilof Islands, and Walt was very interested in that footage. He sent it to some of his editors, and they took the seal footage, they edited it, put it together, put some narration to it, put some really fantastic music to it, and Walt himself coined the term Seal Island. Walt and Roy took the finished product to RKO Pictures, their distributor at the time, and RKO Pictures said no. RKO Pictures did not want to put out a film about seals. Walt Disney and Roy did something that they had done many times in the past. They rented out a theater in Pasadena and showed audiences Seal Island. They did this in time to be considered for Oscar nominations, and sure enough, the following year, Walt Disney and the Disney Studios won an Oscar for Seal Island. The story goes that Walt brought the Oscar to the studios the next day, took it over to Roy's office and said, "Do me a favor, drive over to RKO and hit them upside the head with this Oscar." Probably didn't happen, but the Disney Studios had found a winning combination. They did a second True Life Adventures. RKO Pictures was still reluctant to put this out and say, we're going to release this as a film. So finally, Walt and Roy, disgusted with dealing with RKO, just created their own development company, their own distribution company, Buena Vista Pictures. And from that time forward, the True Life Adventures would be released under the Buena Vista label. Now, the True Life Adventures did something for the Disney Studios that desperately needed to be done. They injected the Disney Studios with some much needed cash. The cool part about the True Life Adventures, they could actually make them fairly cheaply, but they actually got a lot of money from them. So the True Life Adventure served a very definite purpose. But here is the point I want to make when dealing with Walt Disney. It was Disney's interest in nature, Disney's interest in the animals that were there, and I think it's telling that of all the footage the Malotes came back with, Walt was most impressed with the animal footage of the seals. Walt had an interest in nature. Walt had a strong interest in animals. Oftentimes, the Disney studios would bring live animals into the studios so that the animators could practice and study and explore the animals so that when they animated them, it was as realistic looking as possible. And as Walt Disney began development and planning on Disneyland, one of his favorite attractions, one of our favorite attractions, the Jungle Cruise, was originally intended to be a cruise through an actual river with actual lions and rhinos and hippos that you would see. It was various animal experts who had to come to Walt and say, I don't think you're going to get the effect you want because animals are very unpredictable. And chances are, middle of the day, you're going to drive people on a boat past the lions, and they're not really going to see any lions. They're going to probably be hiding. So that inspired the Jungle Cruise we know today with kind of animatronic animals on the shore. Also, the Enchanted Tiki Room was originally dreamed up by Walt as kind of a lounge area where you could enjoy a drink or some snacks while exotic birds flew overhead. It was Disney's Imagineers who said, that's not going to work, Walt. And when he asked why, they said, well, they're going to make a mess of the people and the food and the drinks. Although they were a little more colorful than that. Here's my point. Walt was a big fan of animals. Walt loved animals. Walt loved nature. He was very interested in animals and nature. So here's our question. What would Walt think of Animal Kingdom? And I think he would be very, very thrilled with it. I think he'd be pleased with it. I kind of have visions of Walt riding the safari and saying, this is what I had in mind for my Jungle Cruise. Except instead of a boat, we're on a bus. But I think he would be very pleased with Animal Kingdom. And I think he would be very pleased with the Disney company's efforts at conservation and in trying to help the animals wherever they can. I think Walt would be very pleased with the use of his property and his land for this. So what would Walt think of Animal Kingdom? I think overall, he would like it. Now, might we have some questions about the park's layout and the park's setup? Perhaps. That may be a discussion for another day. But the idea of an animal kingdom, an animal park on Disney property, I don't know if Walt would have been immediately drawn to the idea, but I think he would be pleased if he could see it now. I think he would say, this is something I can get behind. And I know for a fact, I think that would be a fun safari ride, is if I could ride with Walt while he looked around at the lions and the hippos, the rhinos, the giraffes, and all of the animals that populate Animal Kingdom now at Walt Disney World Resort. What do you think? Do you have thoughts about this? You think I'm off base, or do you think that I'm right? That, yeah, Walt Disney would like Animal Kingdom. Let me know your thoughts. Give me some comments. Tell me some ideas for what I should cover next. Give me a like. Give me a subscribe. Thank you for watching this video. I've enjoyed making it. Hey, I hope to see you at Walt Disney World soon. Until then, keep thinking happy thoughts. Thanks, guys.